Hello, good morning. Today I would like to talk about trauma studies, an introduction to trauma studies. As you know, trauma studies got its prominence in the academic world, especially in the post 9/11 literary world. As you know, trauma studies first developed in the 1990s and relied on Freudian theory to develop a model of trauma that imagines an extreme experience which challenges the limits of language, even ruptures meaning altogether. There are two models of trauma theories. One is traditional model and another one is called pluralistic viewpoint. One thing we have to think when we discuss trauma or trauma theory, suffering is unrepresentable. That is the theme or that is the core idea of trauma studies. Sigmund Freud defined trauma as a wound inflicted not upon the body but upon the mind. Freud's theories on traumatic theory, traumatic experience and memory defined the psychological concepts that guide the field of trauma studies. Psychoanalytic theories regarding the origins and effects of trauma arose in the 19th century study of shock and hysteria by researchers who, in addition to Freud, include Joseph Breuer, Pierre Janet, Jean-Martin Charcot, and Abraham Kajiner. Freud's early theories in studies on hysteria, published in 1895, written with Joseph Breuer, and especially his adapted theories later in his career in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, published in 1920, dominate trauma's conceptual employment by literary trauma critics today. In Freud's early work, he argues that traumatic hysteria develops from a repressed earlier experience of sexual assault. Freud and Breuer emphasize in studies in hysteria that the original event was not traumatic in itself, but only in its remembrance, memory. Because the original event continues to inflict harm, the talking cure or aberration is required to understand the effects of the past and gain freedom from its symptom causing grasp. Importantly, the traumatic event is understood only after a latency period of deferred action that delays the effects and meaning of the past. According to Freud or Freudian theory, that traumatic experiences are repeated compulsively, divide the psyche, influence memory differently than other experiences, and are unable to experience initially but only in a narrative reproduction of the past. These are the key points in trauma studies. Trauma is only healed when you have someone truly in your corner. Here is a question: why trauma and why now? Why should trauma attract such attention suddenly and become a pivotal subject connecting all disciplines? It has become a multidisciplinary topic now. 20th century historical knowledge of violence and the experience of ominous start of the 21st century, and especially, as I mentioned earlier, 9/11 literature and trauma. These are the contemporary questions and relevance of trauma studies. The flood of scholarship in the 1990s arose to examine the concept of trauma and its role in literature and society, most prominently by Kathy Kairouts, Feldman, Geoffrey Hartman. In the traditional trauma model pioneered by these writers, especially Kathy Caruth and Feldman, they viewed as an event that fragments consciousness and prevents direct linguistic representation. This model draws attention to the severity of suffering by suggesting the traumatic experience irrevocably damages the psyche. Trauma is an event that shatters identity and remains outside normal memory and narrative representation. Fragmentation or dissociation is viewed as the direct cause of trauma, a view that helps formulate the notion of transhistorical trauma, which suggests that trauma's essential or universal effects on consciousness and narrative recall afford the opportunity to connect individual and collective traumatic experiences. Traumatic experience and its inherent dissociation taught the application of determinate value to that experience, because that level of fright destroys the mind's ability to comprehend it and linguistically code it. Theories to forward a larger post-structural concern with referential limits of language and history. The analysis set the tone for critical debate regarding trauma significance in literature and the relation between individual and cultural trauma. Individual and cultural trauma. Feldman attributes the contemporary enthusiasm in theorizing about trauma to three interrelated 20th century occurrences, three historical occurrences. One, the discovery of psychoanalysis, and with it the discovery of trauma as a new conceptual center, an essential dimension of human and historical experience, and a new type of understanding of historical causality and of historic temporality. The second one, the unprecedented number of disastrous events on a mass scale that wreaked havoc on the 20th century and whose massively traumatic ravages were rendered possibly by the development of weapons of mass destruction and technologies of death that allowed for unprecedented assaults on the human body. And the third one, the unprecedented and repeated use of the instruments of law to cope with the traumatic legacies and the collective injuries left by these events. These are the contributions or views of Feldman about the beginning or evolution of a branch of knowledge called trauma theory. At the same time, Kathy Caruth, she argues that trauma's latency and dissociation disrupts the ability to fully understand or represent a traumatic experience. Both individual and traumatic experiences and collective historical extreme events are ultimately never known directly, but only through an interrupted referentiality that points to the meaning of the past only as a type of reproduction or performance. The idea that a traumatic experience can never be known other than as a recurring absence indicates both the dissociative nature of trauma and its linguistic abnormality. In her book, Kathy Caruth examines a rhetorical potential of recurring figures in text that captures splintered referentiality that points to the knowing and not knowing of the traumatic past, which in turn reveals traumatic nature of history itself. Trauma's psychoanalytical problem for scholars, as conceptualized by Feldman and Kathy Caruth, we can see viewing trauma through the theories of Freud and Lacan as the delayed return of repressed and defining absence. Kathy Caruth argues that trauma is not locating in the simple, violent, or original event in the individual's past, but only identified in the way it is precisely not known in the first instance, or returns to haunt the survivor later on. We can say trauma produces a double paradox in consciousness and language. The contradictory wish to know the meaning of the past, but the inability to comprehend it, as well as the contradictory crisis in the traumatic narrative between the threat of death and survival. Kathy Caruth explains that, I quote, traumatic experience beyond the psychological dimensions of suffering it involves, such as a certain paradox. The most direct seeing of a violent event may occur as an absolute inability to know it. That immediacy paradoxically may take the form of belied or belatedness. Since traumatic experience enters the psyche differently than normal experience and creates an abnormal memory that resists narrative representation. The unique process of this remembering results in an approximate recall but never determinate knowledge. In the second model, pluralistic trauma theory, criticism also developed a theoretical pluralism that pushes directly against the traditional view. The pluralistic model of trauma challenges the unspeakable trope in seeking to understand not only the structural dimensions of trauma that often develop in terms of trauma's dissociative effects on consciousness and memory, but also the second model emphasizes on the cultural dimensions of trauma and diversity of narrative expressions. By moving away from a position that centralizes pathological fragmentation, the pluralistic model suggests that traumatic experience uncovers new relationship between experience, language, and knowledge that detail the social significance of trauma. The study of trauma within this approach provides greater attention to the variability of traumatic representations. Criticism in this vein includes work by Anne Shavovich, Greg Forter, and Naomi Mantel. In this model, trauma is conceptualized as an event that changes perception and identity, yet in the wake of such disturbances, new knowledge is formed about the self and external world. The reorientation of consciousness caused by traumatic events may include an ambiguous referentiality as well as determinate meaning, allowing for trauma's variability in terms of its causes, effects, and representative potential demonstrates the diverse values accorded to a traumatic event and its remembrance. Here lies the importance of personal and cultural trauma. Defining trauma's effects on identity and memory as an interplay of external and internal forces as well as individual character traits, and here cultural factors also. Cultural factors creates a broader appreciation for the links between singular and collective traumatic experiences. The process of memory remains central to depiction of trauma's impact. Maintaining a concept of memory as a fixed process wherein all life experiences are stored exactly and literally lends itself to the traditional trauma model, since the traumatic experience remains frozen in timeless, haunting state. Historical trauma responses. Dory Loeb explains here, the trauma of the Holocaust is inherited by the children of the Holocaust survivors. Present day symptomatology. He added that trauma and literature, trauma and history, trauma and culture. All these multiple engagements are happening in the pluralistic model. Pluralistic model of trauma includes perspectives that argue traumatic memory through disruptive may not necessarily cause pathological symptoms that prevent its retrieval or assimilation into identity. This shifts the focus to the external cultural factors that influence the meaning of traumatic event, because the recollection process in the present moment is influenced by cultural and historical context that impact narrative recall and create knowledge of the past. This is important when we read from trauma literature. The need to tell and retell the story of traumatic experience to make it real both to the victim and to the community, and to tell a reality or truth that is not otherwise available. So when we discuss victims or perpetrators' perspectives, we have to consider these external factors too. Perpetrator relies on silence and secrecy. If that does not work, the credibility of the victim is attacked. The narrative of traumatic memory thus creates different claims to the past, since multiple dimensions or of value arise which are not bound to the concept of speechless absence. The linguistic potential to specifically identity or identify the particular origin and impact of trauma thus permits a particular view of the psyche and identity. Trauma impels people to withdraw and to seek close relationship simultaneously. Victims tend to have intense but unstable relationship with partners when trauma is caused by human sources like war, rape, incest, abuse or torture. Raiders are caught between the victim and the perpetrators, especially if text allows perpetrator's story of his or her own. Here lies a big question for us, for an analytical question here. What trauma has occurred to characters and text or its creator? How has the trauma affected them? In the context of literature and trauma, we have to keep it in mind. When we examining the text, we have to explore the cultural context of an individual or collective group's experience of trauma enables greater attention to representation of extreme experience, as I mentioned earlier, such as rape, war, the Holocaust, Gulag, American slavery, colonial oppression, racism, and recently 9/11 literature. To conclude, let me focus on scholarship in trauma studies and its interconnection with multiple disciplinaries, from feministic studies, post-colonial criticism, post-structuralist criticism, and other point of view. We have to connect these factors from linguistics, ethical terms of representing trauma. How trauma is represented in literary or cultural text, that is also important. In the field of trauma studies, it continues to develop and adapt foundational post-structure approach as well as incorporate new perspectives from post-colonialism, feminist theory, ethnic studies, eco-criticism in scholarship that examines trauma significance in literature and society. By which, let me conclude my speech here. Thank you very much.